Up, we have Jasmin. Jasmin has a bachelor's in marine bio from Charleston College and a master's from Florida State University in biological sciences. While at FSU, Jasmin studied small-tooth sawfish, looking at their nursery habitats and their risk of becoming bycatch in commercial fisheries. Besides her research, Jasmin is also well known for her role as a co-founder of Minorities in Shark Science, amazing group trying to diversify and alleviate barriers to underrepresented people in the field. Currently, Jasmin is a project coordinator for the Marine Science Laboratory Alliance Center of Excellence, which is co-funded by NSF, LSAMP, and includes programs. And we're excited to have her here today, and hopefully that was all correct information. I'll let you introduce yourself and get started.
Yeah, great. So today I'm going to be talking about the small-tooth sawfish and my work with them. So let me get my slides up here. Oh, come on. Okay. All right, so because I'm a Harry Potter nerd, I have entitled this Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. So what fantastic beast are we talking about? We're talking about the small-tooth sawfish. The small-tooth sawfish is one of 5 sawfish species. It is listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. Actually, all 5 species of sawfish are endangered or critically endangered. They are the most endangered family of elasmobranchs in the world. The small-tooth sawfish is born live at between 70 and 80 centimeters. They mature between 250 and 380 centimeters, with females maturing larger. The maximum size is more than 5 meters in length, which was previously a guess, but we recently found a sawfish that was 5 meters. So that is confirmed that they can get up to 5 meters. And they're called sawfish because of this toothed rostrum or saw that they have on the front of their face. Something that's really interesting about them is that this saw is something that they use for hunting and defense. They have all along the bottom of their rostrum or saw ampullae of Lorenzini, which are electromagnetic receptors that allow them to sense the electrical charges of fish. And then they swim into the schools of fish and they whack them with the saws and they swim back through and swallow their prey whole. So it's a very interesting hunting strategy. They're kind of ambush predators. They don't really chase their prey. They mostly lie in wait and wait for them to swim over them, or they slowly cruise undetected and just whack them. They are listed on the Endangered Species Act and have been since 2003, so they are federally protected in the United States. Unfortunately, it is a little late. So the small-tooth sawfish used to be found all over the Western Atlantic, from as far north as North Carolina all the way down to Uruguay. And now they are only found with regularity in South Florida and in the Bahamas. And so their range has shrunk 98% since the Industrial Revolution. In the United States, we actually used to have 2 species of sawfish, the small-tooth sawfish and the large-tooth sawfish. The large-tooth sawfish is locally extinct in the United States. We no longer find them in the United States. So the small-tooth sawfish is the only sawfish that we have left here. And the small-tooth sawfish is definitely in need of some recovery action, which is where we come in. So some major threats that the small-tooth sawfish is facing, largely it's bycatch in commercial fisheries. So the major issue here is that we know that they're caught in commercial fisheries, and we know that the mortality rate in the shrimp fishery as well as the gillnet fishery is extremely high. But due to a lack of observer coverage, we don't know exactly how many sawfish are caught each year in shrimp trawls or the gillnet fishery. So this is a big problem with the management of this species, because one of its major threats, we have no way of actually quantifying how many of the individuals it's taking out each year. So that's one big problem. Another big problem is loss of nursery habitat. They use the mangrove shorelines in Florida and the Bahamas to seek refuge whenever they're young. And with the loss of mangroves, we are seeing a decrease in the survivability of small juvenile sawfish, which is an issue as well. And then on top of all of that, we also have issues with poaching and illegal trade, where people will catch the sawfish and kill them to take their saw to use for decoration. And there are some people that also take the teeth from the saw and they use them to replace the spurs on roosters for cockfighting, which is a very strange thing to kill a sawfish for, but that is also a big problem. As I mentioned, we have an issue with bycatch, and so the recovery team, which was put in place once the small-toothed sawfish was listed on the Endangered Species Act, their role was to assess the threats and viability of restoration for each of those threats. The three commercial fisheries that they looked at were the shrimp, the bottom gillnet, and the bottom longline fishery. They found that the highest threat was the shrimp fishery, and it had a medium restoration potential, and the bottom gillnet and bottom longline were of medium threat severity, and the restoration potential for the bottom longline was incredibly high. And so they actually were able to decrease the mortality risk for sawfish that were caught on long lines by just changing the types of hooks that the longliners use. And that has been super successful. And we've done stress physiology studies with the sawfish, and we've found that with that type of hook and the mandated soak time, the stress levels that sawfish experience on longline is pretty minimal. The gillnet was banned in state waters in 1995. It's still legal in federal waters. So right now, the highest risk is for those sawfish that swim into federal waters, which on Florida, on the east coast of Florida is 3 miles offshore. On the Gulf Coast, it is 9 miles offshore. So it's once sawfish go into the federal waters, then they lack protections. So that's one of the reasons why I included the gillnet in my research as well. So like I mentioned, another issue is the decrease of mangrove, which they use for nursery habitat. And so the sawfish recovery team actually designated 2 critical habitat areas as nursery grounds for sawfish, which you see highlighted here, one in the Charlotte Harbor area, and then one in Everglades National Park and Florida Bay. This is part of the National Marine Sanctuary, the Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and 10,000 Islands Wildlife Refuge. So we have habitat designated for the small juveniles, but at the time of this publishing of critical habitat areas, not a lot was known about the large juveniles and adults and what habitats they were using. And so that's why my research mostly focuses on those large juveniles and adults that are moving around a lot more and have a much larger home range than the small juveniles. So there's 2 parts of my project. The first is assessing bycatch risk. And the second is understanding how sawfish are using different areas along the coast of Florida so that we can hopefully identify high use areas and then really key into what habitats they're using there so that we can begin to identify critical habitat for those large juveniles and adults. So I did this by using telemetry, both satellite and acoustic telemetry. So we caught the sawfish and we tagged 43 internally with a small surgery with acoustic tags, acoustic transmitters, and then 15 were tagged with satellite tags. And you can see here on the map, this is all of the receivers that detected the acoustic transmitters all along the coast of Florida. You can see they were moving pretty far north. They were up in Brunswick, Georgia, as well as Apalachicola Bay right here. And they're found on both sides of the coast. although they're spending the majority of their time in South Florida, they do in fact migrate further north. So for those of you that aren't familiar with telemetry, I'll just briefly explain what acoustic and satellite telemetry is. So acoustic telemetry uses receivers. So this is an acoustic transmitter that you see here, about the size of a pen or a marker. And this is the receivers. So these receivers are stationed all along the coast of Florida. And when a transmitter comes within a detectable range, the receiver can hear the ping that it's giving off, and it records that record and says, this transmitter was here at this time on this day. And we're able to dive down, get these receivers, connect them via Bluetooth to our computers, download the data, and then redeploy them. The issue with acoustic telemetry is that it depends on your receiver coverage. So if an animal is in a place and there's not a receiver there, you don't know where that animal is. But if you do get a detection, you know that it's within a very close proximity of that receiver, so you can get really good fine scale movements. Satellite telemetry, on the other hand, these tags are put on the outside of the sawfish. So they're actually put on the dorsal fin, and they are constantly estimating their position using light, temperature, and depth. And after a certain number of days, they are programmed to detach from the animal, float to the surface, and transmit all of their data to the satellite. So this allows for more continuous tracking of movement. You're not confined to the receiver locations, but it's less accurate because it's an estimate. So by combining these two methods, I was hoping to get some large scale as well as fine scale movement coverage. So let's talk about bycatch risk first. So the first thing I did was I took all of the observer data from the 3 commercial fisheries that I was looking at and plotted as a raster all of the fishing in the past 10 years. And the map here shows you the areas of high concentration of fishing. So the darker the color, the more fishing that is occurring there. So you can think of it as it has the highest probability that someone is launching commercial gear at any given time in that month. And then in blue, we have the probability of a sawfish being there. So as you can see, there are definitely areas where there's high fishing and high sawfish use of the same area at the same time. And this is where we have issues with bycatch. All right, so then I have my space use. So this is a paper that came out in February. The bycatch paper is accepted with minor revisions. I haven't turned in the revisions yet, but it is coming soon. So be on the lookout for that. But I want to focus on my space use today since we have limited time. So for my space use, I actually took all of those receivers and grouped them together into different regions since I wanted to look more large scale. And I did what's called a network analysis. So these nodes here are representing the different regions that I just showed you on the other slide. And then each line between them is an edge. So that represents a movement of a sawfish from one region to another region. And these are directed networks. So I took into account the direction they were traveling in. And the edges are weighted. So the thicker the line, the more movements that happened between those two regions. And I wanted to compare the movement networks for females versus males, for mature versus immature sawfish, and then also comparing how the regions were used across different seasons. To evaluate the differences between these networks, I looked at a couple of different metrics: degree, strength, centrality, and betweenness. So degree is the number of nodes that are connected to a particular node. So in this example up here, we see node 2 is connected to 3 different nodes. So it has the highest degree of this network. So what that basically tells you is this is a very important node in the movement network. So that would indicate that it's a high use area for the sawfish. And then we also factor in strength. And strength takes into consideration not only the number of nodes that it's connected to, but how many movements are made to and from that node. So you might have 2 nodes that have the same degree, but maybe there's just one sawfish that moved between those 3 nodes, whereas a node with a higher strength would have lots of sawfish making lots of movements between those nodes, and therefore it would have a higher strength than the other node that had an equal degree. And then we have PageRank centrality, which shows the relative importance of a node. It's basically a measure of how much the network changes if you were to remove that node. And this is really important when we start thinking about connectivity and thinking about protecting areas. What would happen if we took that region out of the network? How would that affect the movements of the sawfish, which gives it the real world application. And then we have betweenness, which is the number of direct paths that go through a node. So for example, the node 2 has a betweenness of 2 because you have a movement from 1 to 3 that goes through node 2 and a movement from 1 to 4 that goes through node 2. So that would indicate a stopover point or a movement corridor or something like that. So those are the metrics that I was looking at. Then I looked at the total network just because I was curious of how these animals were using the coast of Florida. As you can see, the nodes that are large have the highest strength. And so that indicates that they are very important areas. So as expected, the Charlotte Harbor area, which is important to the small juveniles, is also important to the large juveniles and adults. The area a little bit further offshore along the lower Keys is very important, which is interesting because the current critical habitat area does not include all the way down there. So that indicates that there might be some opportunity for us to expand that critical habitat area to move further into the lower Keys. And then the most surprising finding was this node here off of the coast of Cape Canaveral. We didn't have a lot of reports. We didn't have a lot of observations. Fishers hadn't reported them. Recreational divers hadn't reported them, but apparently sawfish are spending a considerable amount of time off the coast of Cape Canaveral, which was a shock. And that was definitely not expected. So we're definitely going to be doing more research there to figure out exactly where they are and what habitats they're using in those areas. So some things that I found that were interesting were that there were movements up both coasts, and those movements didn't seem to correspond to sex, didn't seem to correspond to size. And so my initial hypothesis was that perhaps the sawfish that were born on the Gulf Coast were going up the Gulf Coast, and those that were born on the East Coast were going up the East Coast. And that trend stuck for most of them, but then there were some sawfish that actually used both coasts, which completely threw off my hypothesis, because if you're using both coasts, it might not be tied to where you were born. So that was very interesting. And so that might be an indicator that there's some other individual assessment of conditions that help the sawfish decide which coast they're going to go up. And I had one sawfish that actually used both coasts in the same year, which was super bizarre. So he started going up the East Coast. He left a month earlier than all of the other sawfish and went about halfway up and then turned around and jetted back to the Keys and then left with everyone else and went up the other coast that time. So it kind of seemed like he was assessing whether he wanted to go up there or not, and he decided it wasn't good and went the other way. So that's something that's a big question that I'm trying to answer right now. And then I was also very interested because some of the sawfish were residential. And so they stayed in the Keys the entire time that we were tracking them. So over the course of 3 years, they didn't move at all. They were in the Keys the whole time. But then there were other sawfish that would migrate, and they would all leave in May for the most part and then come back in November. So they were moving as a collective unit, but not all of them were moving, which was very interesting. And so I have a couple of hypotheses that I'm researching now, some of which have to do with water temperature. Right now, I'm building a model to see if the sawfish count in those regions that are further north changes based on the water temperature. So I'm tracking that now. I also am interested to see if it's maybe some sort of avoidance on the part of females during non-mating periods, but that is thrown off by the fact that males also are migrating. So who knows? It could be related to resource availability. All of these things are really interesting questions that I'm looking at answering. And recently we had a female sawfish pup in Tampa Bay, which we haven't had any record of before. And so there was a bunch of sawfish babies on a public beach. And so now I'm also looking into the fact that there might be an additional nursery ground or in Tampa Bay. So lots of questions related to that. So I'm continuing to track these sawfish. They all have 10-year tags in them. So I'm going to be tracking their movements for 10 years. And I'm eager to see if these patterns hold, what is just a fluke and what is actually a trend. And so hopefully I'll get some answers to some of these burning questions that I have regarding the sawfish movements. And with that, I will open the floor for questions.